The ocean looked empty from a distance, just wind, water, and horizon. But on certain ships, punishment could begin before sunrise and end with nothing left behind except blood in the wake. No courtroom, no appeal, no grave. A single accusation could mean being dragged beneath a ship, abandoned on an island, or turned into a warning for every sailor still alive enough to watch.
A man could disappear at sea so completely that even his family might never learn where he died. That silence was part of the power. On land, punishment usually left traces. Witnesses talked, records survived, bodies were buried. But once a ship crossed beyond the coastline, authority changed shape. The ocean erased evidence faster than any court could demand it. For pirate crews, discipline was not optional, it was survival. A ship carried too many armed men, too little food, and too much temptation to survive without fear holding everything together. One theft, one lie during battle, one act of cowardice when cannon fire began, and the balance could collapse. Pirates understood that better than anyone, because most of them had once served under naval captains who ruled through violence long before they ever raised a black flag. What made pirate punishment especially unsettling was how deliberate it often was. These were not random explosions of rage from drunken men. They were methods refined across decades of maritime life, inherited from navies, modified by outlaw crews, and used with cold purpose. Every punishment had an audience. Every sentence carried a message larger than the man receiving it. One of the most feared began with ropes being prepared in silence. The word sounded almost technical, almost harmless if spoken quickly, keel hauling. But the reality was one of the most brutal punishments ever used on open water. A man's wrists were tied, sometimes his ankles too. A rope ran from one side of the ship, under the hull, and up the other side. Then he was pushed overboard. The ship itself became the weapon. Below the waterline, the hull was never smooth. After weeks at sea, it collected layers of barnacles, shell growths hard as stone, jagged enough to cut through skin like blades. As the crew hauled the rope, the body below scraped across that entire surface. Back, shoulders, neck, legs, every exposed part dragged against those razor edges while seawater forced itself into the wounds. If the rope moved too slowly, the man drowned before reaching the other side. If it moved too fast, he survived long enough to feel everything. Either way, survival rarely meant recovery. When he emerged, if he emerged conscious at all, his body often looked less like flesh and more like torn cloth soaked in red water. Barnacles ripped deep enough to expose muscle. Salt flooded every wound instantly. Infection came next if drowning had not already finished the work. The punishment did not begin with pirates. Dutch naval law recorded formal keel hauling in the 16th century as punishment for severe shipboard crimes. But pirates adopted it because it solved several problems at once. It punished betrayal, it terrified the crew, and it reminded everyone watching that the ship itself belonged to whoever controlled the ropes. No speech was needed afterward. The sound alone stayed with men who witnessed it. The scraping beneath the hull, the sudden silence when the body vanished underwater, the heavy strain of sailors pulling together while pretending not to imagine themselves in the same place. That fear mattered because pirate ships often operated under written agreements called articles. Men signed them when they joined. Shares of treasure were listed. Voting rights were listed. Punishments were listed too, which meant that sometimes the same crew who elected their captain also agreed in advance to what would happen if one of them broke trust. That contradiction sat at the center of pirate life. Freedom existed, but only inside rules backed by violence. And if keel hauling represented the sea itself becoming executioner, the next punishment relied on something much simpler. A wooden handle, 9 cords, knots tied for tearing flesh. Before a man ever faced death, he might first be ordered forward in front of everyone he sailed with, because punishment worked best when 60 men watched one body break. The whip waited long before the first strike landed.
The cat-o'-nine-tails looked simple enough in the hand, but simplicity was part of its cruelty. 9 separate cords hung from a short handle, each cord knotted so that every strike landed as multiple impacts instead of one. A single lash could open skin immediately. By 10, the back began to swell and split. By 20, the body no longer reacted in clean movements, but in uncontrolled spasms, as if pain itself had replaced muscle. And still the counting continued. On naval ships, flogging existed inside official procedure, at least in theory. Charges were read, officers observed, limits were written down, though often ignored. Pirate ships stripped away even that thin appearance of restraint. A sentence could be delivered because the captain ordered it, because the quartermaster agreed, or because the crew demanded an example. What mattered was not only pain, it was visibility. A punishment delivered below deck corrected one man. A punishment delivered in sunlight corrected everyone. The condemned sailor was usually tied where every eye could reach him, sometimes to a mast, sometimes bent across a gun carriage. The crew formed a rough half-circle, not merely watching, but absorbing the lesson. Every strike made clear that equality aboard a pirate ship ended where the code had been broken.
That code could be surprisingly detailed. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirate captains of the 18th century, enforced written articles with remarkable precision. Men under his command voted on major decisions, divided plunder according to rank, and were promised compensation for injuries suffered in battle. Lose a leg, receive a fixed share. Lose an eye, receive another. But that same written agreement also specified punishment for theft, desertion, or lying to fellow crewmen. So a sailor might stand beside men who had signed the same document he had signed, and those same men would watch while his back was torn apart because the contract allowed it. That is what makes pirate violence more disturbing than simple lawlessness. It was often structured, collective, rational in its own brutal logic. After enough lashes, skin stopped splitting cleanly and began to hang in strips. Blood darkened the deckboards. Salt air entered every wound immediately. The pain afterward often mattered more than the beating itself, because sleep became impossible and infection arrived quickly in humid heat. Some men survived physically but never regained full strength. Others survived the whipping only to face a second punishment later if they were judged dangerous enough to remain alive but untrustworthy enough to stay aboard. That second punishment required almost no effort from the crew at all. No whip, no rope under a hull, no need for anyone to keep striking. Only a shoreline, a pistol, and a departing ship. Marooning was terrifying because it transferred the violence from men to time itself. A crew rowed the condemned sailor to land, often a small island barely visible on charts, then left him
There, with minimal supplies. Sometimes a little powder, sometimes a bottle of water if mercy still existed that day. Sometimes nothing except a firearm with a single shot. The single bullet carried its own message. It was not meant for hunting. Most islands chosen for marooning had little to hunt anyway. It was not meant for defense. There was often nothing there to defend against except heat, thirst, and waiting. The bullet existed because everyone understood how slowly dehydration kills. Pirates usually reserved marooning for betrayal that threatened the collective itself. A man who stole from another crew member could be whipped. A man who endangered the entire ship through cowardice or deception might instead be left where no witness could hear him. The choice of island mattered. Crews preferred places far enough from trade routes that rescue was unlikely. Low stretches of sand, scattered rock, no trees, little shade, nowhere to hide from midday sun. Fresh water determined whether a man lasted 3 days or 10. At noon, heat became its own punishment. Salt dried on the skin, lips split, the body began making decisions against itself, conserving strength until even standing felt expensive. And then came night, when the same island turned cold and the sound of the sea became unbearable, because every wave reminded the condemned man that escape was visible but unreachable. Some tried building rafts from driftwood. A few succeeded. Most never had enough strength before thirst destroyed judgment. Edward England, once a pirate captain feared across the Indian Ocean, suffered this sentence himself after his own crew judged him too merciful towards captured enemies. He survived long enough to reach Madagascar, but survival did not restore his power. He died there poor, cut off from the world he had once ruled with cannon and fear. Marooning proved something pirate crews understood deeply. Death did not need witnesses to remain terrifying. Sometimes the cruelest punishment was the one no one stayed to watch. But even pirates eventually discovered that the empire hunting them had its own theater of fear, and it would use dead bodies the way pirates used living ones. Because once the hanging ended, punishment often continued for years above the waterline.
Execution on land was supposed to end a life. For pirates, the authorities wanted it to begin a second warning. After the hanging, the body was not always buried. Sometimes it was coated in tar while the flesh was still fresh, sealed against rapid decay, and locked inside an iron frame built specifically around its shape. Arms pinned, torso enclosed, legs fixed inside metal bars. The cage was then lifted onto a post near the water, positioned where arriving ships could not avoid seeing it. This was gibbet punishment, and unlike the violence pirates carried out among themselves, this one belonged openly to empire. The cage itself was carefully made. Blacksmiths shaped iron to fit the executed body closely enough that once riveted shut, removal became impossible without tools. Some cages held the corpse upright so that from a distance it looked almost alive, as if a silent figure were standing guard above the harbor. Others allowed the body to hang slightly forward, turning slowly when the wind shifted. The intention was not hidden. Every sailor entering port was meant to look up. William Kidd became one of the most famous examples. After his execution in London, his body was tarred and suspended near the Thames at Tilbury, directly on the route used by ships approaching the city. Men arriving from sea saw him before they saw much of London itself. For years, weather changed his shape, but not his presence. Flesh darkened, shrank, disappeared. Iron remained.
That endurance mattered. The authorities understood something pirates also understood. Fear works best when repeated. A dead man hanging for 1 day shocks. A dead man hanging through winter, storms, and summer heat becomes memory embedded in trade routes. By the early 18th century, this practice intensified as piracy spread across Atlantic waters. After Bartholomew Roberts was killed in battle, dozens of captured crew members were tried, hanged, and several of their bodies displayed in iron cages near coastal points chosen for maximum visibility. Harbors, river mouths, anchorage routes, places where merchant crews waited for tide changes and had nothing to do but stare. The message was calculated with almost scientific precision.
This is what waits at the end of piracy. Not only death, but exposure after death. No disappearance, no romantic legend, no sea burial. Just iron, wind, and slow decay in public view. What makes this history unsettling is how closely both sides mirrored each other. Pirates dragged men beneath hulls to teach obedience. Governments hung bodies in cages for the same reason. Pirates marooned traders where nature would finish the sentence. States selected visible coastlines where weather would do the same. Both understood that punishment was never only about the condemned person. It was about everyone still deciding what rules they would obey. And the sea, despite its reputation, was never truly lawless. It simply held competing systems of law, each enforced by terror, each convinced its violence was necessary. On one ship, a man signed articles promising loyalty and knew the whip waited if he broke them. On another, a naval captain sailed beneath the body of an executed pirate and understood exactly why it had been placed there. Fear moved in both directions across the same water.
That may be why pirate punishments still disturb people centuries later. Not because they were unusually savage for their time, but because they stripped power down to its clearest form. No speeches, no ceremony beyond what terror required. Just bodies used to control other bodies. A rope under a hull, a whip across open skin, a pistol left on hot sand, an iron cage above a river. Different instruments, same logic. The ocean erased names quickly, but it preserved methods. And long after the ships rotted away, that lesson remained. On the open sea, authority belonged to whoever could make fear last longer than mercy.